So practical. Welcome to this tutorial, which will introduce you to some of the basics of MLA style, including in-text citations and the Works Cited page. We're going to cover the anatomy of a Works Cited entry and finding the right information in print and web sources to build citations. So what is MLA style? The Modern Language Association is the organization which establishes common conventions in the humanities for citation and documentation of sources. In general, MLA style is composed of two elements: the in-text citation, which is sometimes called parenthetical citation since the citations appear in parentheses after the borrowed material, and the Works Cited page, which is a list of sources directly quoted or paraphrased in your text. All quoted or paraphrased material must contain a citation, which can be traced to an element of the Works Cited page. We'll come back to the in-text citation after examining Works Cited entries. The Works Cited page is an alphabetical list of quoted or paraphrased sources in your paper, and only sources which are directly quoted or paraphrased should appear in the Works Cited list. The list appears on a separate page, which has its own format, and we'll look at how to format this page soon. Each entry in the list must contain certain pieces of information about the source in a specific order, so let's look at some examples. On screen, you can see a fully formatted Works Cited page which lists a few diverse sources in alphabetical order arranged by the first element of the entry. The list is double-line spaced, and the entries are formatted with hanging indentation. The title Works Cited is centered on its own line with no special formatting, and the page number appears in the top right-hand corner. Let's dig deeper into how to construct these entries. Such core. On the screen, you can see the skeleton of a Works Cited entry, and the first thing we need to get acquainted with are the core elements: the author's name, the title of the source, and the location. The core elements are highlighted in yellow and bolded. The author element refers to the individual or individuals who created the source. In the author element, list the author by their last name. We invert the author's name with a comma between the first and last name, and end the element with a period. Many sources have a single author, but some sources have two or more authors. Some sources have three or more authors. In the examples, most of these entries are single author sources. The func source has more than three authors. When a source has three or more authors, we list only the author with the alphabetically primary last name followed by the Latin phrase et al., meaning and others. We only list multiple authors in the author element when there are exactly two authors, as we'll see soon. Sometimes a source has no specific author because it was anonymous or prepared by an organization, such as the example from the MLA handbook itself at the bottom of the example list. When an author is anonymous, or the organization which created the text is both author and publisher, omit the author element and begin the entry with the title of the source. After the author element, we write the title of the source. The source is the most direct text from which you're borrowing language. A source can be a chapter in a print book, a page on a website, a song from an album, an episode in a podcast, or other media. In the examples, our sources include web pages, print sources, and video. The titles of all these items appear enclosed within quotation marks. Usually a source is contained within a larger text called a container. For example, chapters are contained within books, web pages are contained within websites, songs are contained within albums, etc. Sometimes the source and container are identical if we're borrowing frequently from many places within a longer text. For example, in the Nestle print source, food politics is both container and source, so we simply list the container as the source. In the source element with a period, unless the source is also the container, then in the container element with a comma. Finally, the location of a source depends on the media of the container. For print sources, the location consists in a physical page range across which the source exists within the larger container. For example, the Sedaris source exists within the larger anthology, The Norton Reader, between pages 34 and 41. The details of MLA style source exist within the MLA handbook across pages 61 through 128. In these cases, abbreviate a physical page range with two lowercase p's followed by a period. Since the Nestle source refers to the whole container, we did not need to list the page range in the Works Cited entry, since the specific page numbers will also appear in the in-text citation. For electronic sources, the location is usually a URL, such as in the Brooks source, the func source, and the Jensen source, in the location element with a period. Such other. In addition to the core elements, most sources contain other elements we should keep track of as well. Not all sources contain all these other elements, but we should keep track of as many of the other elements as the source provides us. These other elements, highlighted in green, are separated by commas. The container. The container is the largest unit containing a source, such as physical books, albums, television series, feature films, social media platforms, periodicals, websites, etc. For example, in the Brooks source, the New York Times. In the Funk source, the Pew Research Center. In the Jensen source, YouTube. In the Nestle source, Food Politics. In the Sedaris source, the Norton Reader. And in the Details of MLA Style source, the MLA Handbook. Other contributors. Occasionally, in addition to authors, a text will name other important individuals, such as translators or editors. These individuals should be named and identified by their role, for example, translated by or edited by. For example, in the Sedaris source, the Norton Anthology has more than 3 editors, so the alphabetically primary editor is listed with the phrase et al. The version. The version is largely a convention of print sources, but occasionally electronic sources are released in subsequent editions, such as academic journals. The print Nestle, Sedaris, and MLA sources each have versions. The Nestle source is in the 10th edition. The Sedaris source is in the 14th edition. And the MLA source is in the 8th edition. The number. Occasionally you will deal with sources which are released in numbered sequence, such as academic journals, a series of volumes, such as comic books, or in serial, such as the series of television seasons. None of our examples are installments in a sequence, so we can omit this element. The publisher. Sources are related to organizations responsible for making it available to the public. For print sources, the publisher is a press, such as Oxford University Press. For films, the publisher is the distribution company, such as 20th Century Fox. And for web pages, the publisher is the organization related to the copyright notice of the homepage. In the Jensen source, the publisher is TED. In the Nestle source, the publisher is the California University Press, abbreviated UP. In the Sedaris source, the publisher is Norton. Publishers should be omitted in the following cases. Periodicals, such as the New York Times and the Brooks source, which is the container and publisher, which is almost always the case with news periodicals. Website titles, which are essentially the same as the publisher, such as the Pew Research Center and the Funk source. A website which hosts but did not publish the content, and self-published works. The publication date. The publication date is the most recent date the content was made available or revised. If a source has multiple dates of publication, use the most recent date. For print books, use the publication year, which matches the most specific version of the text listed on the copyright page, such as in the Nestle source, the Sedaris source, and the MLA source. For websites, use the most recent publication date, which appears on the page, usually close to the author's name and the source title, or the most recent copyright date in day, month, year format, such as in the Brooks source, the Funk source, and the Jensen source. For social media posts, such as a tweet, you should also include the timestamp, the hour and minute of the day the content was posted. You might be rightly wondering, well, that's all fine and good, but where's all this information at? I'm glad you asked. First, we need to locate the core elements, and then we can identify which other elements are also present in the source. So let's look at the Brooks source, which is a website with a single author. Websites usually have fewer pieces of information to keep track of than print sources. For the Brooks source, all the information we need is organized at the top of the page. Brooks's name, the title of the source, and the publication date are all conveniently located in a cluster right at the top of the article. We will need to reorganize the date to fit the day, month, year format. Web sources usually display all this information together. The only other elements we lack to complete our entry are the container, which is the New York Times, and the location, which is the URL. Now it's just a matter of putting the information in the correct order and formatting it. But wait, what's going on with this silly indention? This silly indention is called hanging indention, and there's a couple of ways for creating one. It's important to know how to format a hanging indention, so I'll show you 2 ways to do it in Google Docs, which are like how you would also do it in Word. Let's look at a new source, this time with 2 authors, and build a new entry from the ground up, and we'll end with how to format hanging indention. When a source has more than 1 author, we don't have to change much from a web source with a single author, like the Brooks source. We look for the same info, but represent the author section a little differently. On screen, you can see an article published by the website The Conversation, which the right sidebar informs us has 2 authors, Lori Kogan and Shelley Volsch. To start this source, we identify which author's last name is alphabetically first, regardless of the order in which the source lists them, and invert that name. Then we simply list the second author without inversion. As you can see in the model, I've inverted Kogan's name followed by Volsch's name, listed normally, ending with a period. The rest of the source we fill out the same way as Brooks. Notice that our headline is not capitalized headline style, so we'll have to change this when we type in our Works Cited entry. As you can see, we've capitalized most of the words in the title except the preposition to. The title of our container is The Conversation, which we will write in italics. Our publication date contains a timestamp, but we don't require this information, so we can ignore it and just write 11 September 2020. Finally, we copy and paste our URL. We end our entry with a period. But we're not done yet because we still need to format the entry with double line spacing and hanging indention. To double line space the entry, highlight the text, and navigate to the line spacing options on the toolbar and select double. The final thing to do is format our hanging indention. I'll show you how to format using the sliders and the ruler, then I'll show you how to use the indention settings. First, highlight all the text you want to format as a hanging indent. Anything you highlight will be formatted, so it's important to highlight everything you want. Along the top of the app, you can see the ruler. At the front of the ruler are the sliders. On Google Docs, there are 2 sliders which can move together or separately. We want to click and hold the bottom inverted triangle slider so that we move both sliders at the same time and pull them a ½ inch from the left margin and release them. This will move the whole highlighted block of text a ½ inch away from the left-hand margin. Then, with the text still highlighted, click and hold just the top slider and slide it back to the left-hand margin. You have achieved hanging indention. But that's not the only way to do it. To create a hanging indention with the formatting settings, again, highlight the text you want to format, then navigate to the Format option along the top toolbar. Hover the cursor over the Align and Indent option. From the pop-out menu, select Indention Options. Under Special Indention, click the drop-down menu and select Hanging. Then click Apply. Quotation. In-text citation, also called parenthetical citation, consists in adding information in parentheses to the end of directly quoted or paraphrased material to indicate a source in the Works Cited page from which the borrowed language or ideas derive. On screen, you can see some examples of in-text citation. In each example, I've woven the quotes organically into the grammar of my own words and introduced each with a comma. We enclose the quote in quotation marks, followed by the in-text citation and a period. Note that we always follow the citation with a period to end the sentence. Unless the language we quote ends with special punctuation, like a question mark or exclamation point, we omit the punctuation which may occur within the quote. If the source has an author, like most of our sources in the examples do, use the author's last name inside the citation. This clearly links the borrowed material in your document to an element in the Works Cited list. For example, the quote attributed to Nestle in the citation is clearly sourced to the Works Cited entry which begins Nestle. In this way, in-text citation is a form of indexing. Generally, your citations will contain the author's last name unless there is no author, as in the case of the MLA source. When a source has no author, we use an abbreviated version of the title or whatever distinguishing information appears in place of the author element in the Works Cited entry. When dealing with print sources, such as the Nestle attribution, we also include the page number from which the borrowed language derives. In general, we omit this information when dealing with web sources and simply list a single author's last name. Such as in the Brooks attribution, both authors' names when there are two authors, such as the Kogan and Volsch attribution, or the single author's last name and the Latin phrase et al. When there are three or more authors, such as the Funk attribution. The Nestle example uses an ellipsis. We use the ellipsis to indicate that we have omitted some unnecessary information from the interior of the quote. In general, we want to represent quotes as accurately as they appear in the original source, but you may have to amend quotes to make them fit into the grammar of your sentence. If you must alter a quote to make it accord grammatically into your sentence, use the ellipsis to indicate that you have omitted language. The biggest virtue to exercise when quoting is parsimony, the quality of being stingy. We only want to borrow the most essential language, which supports our point. We don't want to take too much, but we don't want to take too little. We want to keep our focus on our own words, not the words of someone else, so we want the language we borrow to be brief, and we want to contextualize and explain it. We can distill these concerns into two ideas. Keep your quotes relevant and give them context. Relevance will depend on your thesis and the focus of your paragraphs, but context starts with how we weave the quote into our own words, which includes the citation. We aim to weave quotes organically into our syntax, which is a fancy way of saying we want to make these quotes part of our sentences in a grammatically correct way.